Supports. They are the most important unit in either Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail. Simply put, because HSR is a game that is primarily built around hypercarry-oriented teams, whether that's your singular damage dealer like Imbibe Lunai or Sealy, or whether you're going to have a destruction character off to the side, such as Blade. You are primarily focusing on buffing their damage to the highest you can. With Blade in this instance, it can be with Yukong, it can be with somebody like Fushuan, or whatever the case may be. Whereas with Imbibe Lunai and Sealy, you are incredibly dependent on the attack buffs you can get, whether that's from a Bronya or a Yukong as well, whether you have an E1 Fushuan or a Tingyun. Either way, your entire account and the damage you're dealing is dependent primarily on the supports. A unit can have high base damage, but that just means they have a higher ceiling once you buff them up. And so as a result, summoning and pulling for new DPS units, even if you already have, let's say hypothetically, you have Yanqing as one who you built up quite nicely, and then you have a Sealy on the other half. These are two good units at base value. Instead, the thing that's going to be stopping you more often than not will be whether or not your team can survive. So any form of abundance, any form of preservation will help you a lot in that regard. Because a new DPS is just replacing the other one you have, and unless it's a dramatic improvement over the other one, it's not really worthwhile. Hypothetically, if you're using Yanqing and you get an Imbibe Lunai, Lunai will be better than your Yanqing, especially in AoE scenarios. But if you're comparing somebody like a Sealy to a character like Blade and Imbibe Lunai, especially with those two destruction units, it's a bit more difficult to see where the difference is unless they're weak to elemental reactions or specific elements like wind or imaginary weak enemies. And so as a direct result of that, it determines and much more is dependent on the skill point consumption, the ease of use in terms of building these characters out, the natural tankiness of characters like Blade versus the AoE potential of someone like Imbibe Lunai, or the self-buffs that somebody like Lunai gets compared to Blade and Sealy. And as a result of that, because characters are essentially self-contained in terms of DPS, is because there's no elemental reactions like there are in Genshin, and because every team is a hypercarry-oriented team, your supports, like Lynx and Fushuan, well, Lynx and Fushuan have much more flexibility and much more versatility for your account overall. They're bringing more to the table, simply because you can slide either of these two characters onto whatever team you want and their jobs will be fulfilled. Lynx will always be a good healer for any team that doesn't have a healer. The same thing will go for Fushuan being a preservation character to keep your team alive. Whereas if you're using a Lunai and you picked him up from after getting Blade, after getting Sealy, after having another DPS built, then these units aren't really going to be paired together, because you need to consider the skill point consumption of someone like Sealy versus somebody like Lunai, and you can't necessarily have them on the same team. So as a result, your DPS units are a bit less consistent because you are replacing every DPS with another DPS, and the chances are that if you have one DPS, hypothetically let's say you're using Blade or Lunai, you pulled for either one of these two, those characters aren't usually going to be running the same team. Now, don't get me wrong, they can be at certain times. I, for instance, did a run with both of them. But for the vast majority of you, every DPS will just be replaced by the next one after. And so your investment into them, in terms of skills, in terms of traces and relics, will be the determining factor in who you're building. Because if they use the same mats, hypothetically, once again, we'll stick with the Blade and Lunai or the Sealy and Yanqing area. With these two characters, they are both hunts, so they both use the same amount of mats, and that means that you're splitting resources between them, which could otherwise be put into investing into one much more heavily. Even if the damage is higher, if you don't have the ability to support them, more often than not, you aren't getting more value. And if you have to reinvest all the resources to get their traces up, a new relic set altogether that you don't have previously, and a new light cone, well, that unit, even though they already have and will have a higher damage ceiling, they're taking longer to reach that potential in comparison to just buffing and boosting up the units you already have. So instead of going for a new DPS, instead of going to Eidolon 2 or Eidolon 1 on a character that you already have, my recommendation would be pull for a support who can offer more versatility to your account, invest into a support who can assist in fixing other characters or providing them with some new damaging options, such as Blade, because Bronya and Blade work really well together, or pull for defensive options if you don't have those. Lynx, Fushuan, Silverwolf, Bronya, these are characters who will hold consistent value over time because all of them can be used where other characters like Blade, Kafka, Imbibe Lunai, and pretty much any DPS, especially Jing Yuan, will fade over time, either as you get stronger damage dealers who can replace them, or as you just stop using them because your teams switch around. Supports, whether they are buffing characters like Harmony units such as Ting Yun and Yukong, or debuffing characters such as Pela, always hold long-term value because they are always viable. Your Pela will always be able to debuff any enemy. As a result, you building her is less of a waste than if you were to build one DPS and never touch them again, or another DPS and never touch them again just because they had higher damage. If you're always building for the next DPS and the previous DPS was a waste, because for the vast majority of you, let's say hypothetically you get one of every DPS character, just get them at E0, S1, or E0 without the light cone. At a certain point, they're going to overlap in elements. For instance, Kafka and Jing Yuan are both lightning characters. I don't need another lightning character. And if we're talking about Sealy, depending on what you're doing with quantum-oriented teams, your Silver Wolf may replace your Sealy. And as a result, you only need 1 to 2 baseline DPSs. If they are heavily invested and good, you kind of covered in that aspect. For the vast majority of people, the main thing you needed was a Luocha if you didn't have a Bailu. And if you skipped out on Luocha and didn't get a Bailu, you were waiting on other defensive options. But you got lucky with Japard, a Lynx, or a Fushuan, doesn't matter. You were just waiting for another character to keep you alive. And now that these 2 slots are fulfilled, with the Abundance and Preservation units, you can start to shift more focus into building out your harmonies, your supports, your characters that you may already have that you just haven't had the opportunity to heavily invest into because you've been waiting for someone else to help you stay alive. Supports are essentially the lifeblood of this game. If we're looking at something like Genshin, Bennett stayed relevant forever and still is, in comparison to a character like Ganyu or a DPS like Diluc. Zhongli was released and stayed relevant forever. A support's lifespan is far more it's just far longer in general and holds more consistent value to almost everyone who gets them in comparison to a DPS who may otherwise be replaced or pushed out of the meta depending on the elemental weaknesses of the characters you're fighting or the mechanics of the enemy. For instance, if your character or the enemy you're facing off against has self-revive, Seely's Resurgence falls out the window and her damage lowers a lot more in comparison to AoE characters like in Babylon 9. And so it's always important to consider just what a character brings to the table and how likely you are to replace them. I'm not talking about replacing them with a character of the exact same element. I'm just simply talking about replacing them in a character that does the exact same role as them. Your DPSs have one job. It is to deal damage. If you summon for a new damage dealer, they are now contesting for the exact same position in your teams. Whereas your supports have one job, to support your team, and they can do that in any team. They may be the best option in one scenario, whereas another one, like Lynx for example, may be better when you're being debuffed constantly, or when you have someone like Kafka who's messing up your teams. You may have Japard when you don't want to take damage for certain characters. Your supports have a bit more flexibility in situations in which one may overtake the other. Your DPSs are usually only limited and determined by one factor, the element they have, and the AoE versus single target scenarios that you can place them into. But tell me your thoughts down below. Who do you think was the best character you picked up for your accounts? For me, I will probably mark that as my Silver Wolf. I mean, she's the only character I've invested this much into as of yet. Before yesterday, she wasn't. She's E6. But as of right now, my Fushuan's at the exact same point. My Lynx is at the exact same point as well. So, yeah, obviously my Fushuan's not E6. But, you know, I still think Silver Wolf was one of the better characters because she's always a secondary DPS on any of my teams. But she's E6, so she kind of has the option to be that. But what about the rest of you? What are your thoughts? Either way, subscribe if you found this little weird mini rant enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.